Call to order the James City County Planning Commission regular meeting for April 4th, 2018. Mr. Holt, would you call the roll?
Ms. Leverins. Here. Ms. Leverins is an at-large member. Mr. Polster. Here. Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Schmidt.
Here.
Mr. Schmidt represents the Roberts District and is this year's vice chair. Mr. O'Connor.
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Mr. Kropp.
Here.
Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District. Mr. Richardson.
Here.
Mr. Richardson represents the Stonehouse District and is this year's chair. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning for the county, and sitting to my left, by special guest invitation, is our very own county attorney, Mr. Adam Kinsman. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Holt.
Thank you.
I'd like to open the public comment portion of this evening's meeting. This is the portion where topics that are offered are not subject to a public hearing. So if there's anyone who would like to speak this evening, seeing and hearing no one, we will close the public comment section and seek the reports from our commissions for the committees, the DRC. Mr. Schmidt. No worries.
The Development Review Committee, DRC, met on Wednesday, March 28th, with all members present. DRC reviewed one site plan appeal for discussion and one permit case. First order of business was subdivision 0037-2012 site plan. DRC reviewed an appeal to the Director of Planning's decision that the architectural elevations recently submitted to the county for Walnut Grove subdivision in Norge did not match those that had been approved in 2005 when the land was last rezoned. While there were many architectural elements that remained similar, there were several discrepancies. These inconsistencies included side door entry to many structures rather than front door entry, changes to the bay window schemes, changes to some roof lines that would be noticeable from the front, and finally some window alterations. The applicant, J. Epstein, made a presentation with the structural elevations from 2005 set next to the 2018 elevations. Mr. Epstein explained how in the 13 years since the original elevations, new technologies and building materials have become available that factored into some of the elevation alterations. He also stated that some of the changes came about due to a desire to make the buildings more energy efficient. For instance, according to Mr. Epstein, the roof line changes would allow for the better positioning of solar panels and therefore more energy efficient dwellings. Mr. Epstein's presentation was then followed by architect John McClendon, who explained how some of the revisions allowed for a non-traditional but more practical use of space within the home. He explained that in the 13 years since 2005, that there are new desires in the market for the use of space within a residence that were driving some of their elevation changes. It should also be noted that the applicant stipulated that all other agreed to aspects of this development, such as the number of structures, the setbacks, and the buffers between nearby communities, will remain identical to the plan from 2005. Following the applicant's presentation, several committee members expressed concern that the new elevations deviated from what had already been agreed upon during the legislative process in 2005, when the Board of Supervisors originally reviewed the visuals of building elevations during that process. There was also concern that solar panels on homes in the community might have an unwanted impact on adjacent developments, and the positioning of the solar panels was discussed with the applicant. Alternatively, some DRC members remarked that many years had passed since the original approval and that technologies had changed to the point where it made sense to allow some elevation changes to keep up with the changing times, and that the alterations did not appear to be out of place with the wants and needs of James City County residents in the 2003 Comprehensive Plan for the Norge and Toano Community Character Corridor. The DRC voted 3-1 in favor of the applicant's appeal. This case will be included in tonight's consent agenda. Next case, or second order, was case number 0006-2018. This is 7250 Audi, which is an off-site drain field. This is in the Chickahominy Haven area subdivision. For this case, the DRC was tasked with whether or not to permit an off-site septic field for a subdivision lot in Chickahominy Haven. For the home to be built, it would need to have an on-site septic system, but in this case, there was not adequate room for both the septic tank and the drain field on the home site. Instead, the applicant has requested an exception due to an existing easement that provides for access to a potential drain field in an adjacent lot across the road. Such a request can be granted under the subdivision ordinance exception with the blessing of the DRC. The planning staff felt that this particular application met all requirements for such an exception. If approved by the DRC, the applicant would still need to comply with floodplain regulations per James City County's zoning ordinance rules. Both planning staff and the applicant, Wayne Cook, spoke to the DRC and answered some questions. The DRC discussed the implications that sea level rise might eventually have on this project, and then listened to several concerned citizens from the neighborhood. The homeowner in the neighboring lot across the street that would accommodate the drain field expressed some concerns about possible negative impacts to his property from this construction. Planning staff mentioned that the existing easements have some built-in protections for that property. DRC recommended to staff that the county attorney further explain such protections for the concerned neighbor at the next full Planning Commission meeting. The DRC voted four in favor and none against the issuing of this permit exception. This case will also be included in tonight's consent agenda. And then I have a quick update. We had some email communications after that meeting regarding the homeowner who was concerned about what protections they might have. And the update is as follows. After the meeting, it was brought to the attention of the DRC that any future legal dispute around the potential negative impacts on the neighboring lot would be a private matter and therefore would need to be enforced through the courts. Wow, that was a lot of words.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? Great, thank you. Now we would move on to policy. Mr. Haldeman?
Sure, thank you. The Policy Committee last met on March 8th. The meeting came to order at 4 p.m. The committee made final adjustments for prioritizing capital improvement projects submitted by the staffs of various county departments and divisions and unanimously recommended the Policy Committee scores to the Planning Commission. The committee will next meet on March 19th at 6 p.m. There was no new business. The meeting adjourned at 4:45 p.m.
Thank you. And now we move on to our consent agenda. Consent agenda items are determined to be non-controversial. However, a planning commissioner can pull any item for discussion. There are, in this particular case, 4 items for consideration. As Mr. Schmidt mentioned, we have the DRC reports and also our minutes from the March 7th and the March 19th special meetings. Comments or anyone desire to pull any of the items? Can I entertain a motion?
Motion to approve the consent agenda, Mr. Chairman.
Moved? Second? Do not. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And now we will move on to the public hearings portion of our meeting this evening. Our public hearing is SUP 0002-2018, 234 Peach Street Tourist Homes. Mrs. Suloff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Mrs. Jennifer Campbell has applied for a special use permit to allow the operation of a tourist home at 234 Peach Street. The tourist home SUP will allow for the short-term rental of a 4-bedroom home with no changes to the size or footprint of that home. The property is located outside of the primary service area, is zoned A1 General Agricultural, and is designated Economic Opportunity by the adopted comprehensive plan. Staff considered the home's location, lot size, parking provisions, and screening all to be factorable favors in the evaluation of this application. The property has an existing driveway access off a shared ingress-egress easement and an existing parking area, both sufficient enough to accommodate guests. Staff is recommending conditions which are intended to mitigate the impacts of the use and preserve the residential character of the site. Such conditions include linking the SUP to a master plan should the owners choose to expand their property in the future, limitations on the number of rooms rented, and limitations on the number of contract parties per night. Staff finds the proposal to be compatible with the 2035 Comprehensive Plan, the zoning ordinance, and surrounding development, and recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the conditions included in tonight's packet. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicant is available as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Suloff. Any questions for staff? Thanks very much. And open the public hearing for SUP 002-2018. I have no speaker cards, but perhaps the applicant would like to make a presentation.
Have to.
Don't have to.
I just want to thank you for allowing
You
us
state your
the
name and address,
opportunity.
please.
I'm sorry. My name is Jennifer Campbell. This is my husband, Gary. And just pray that you would approve this this application. My children and I and my husband, we've been homeschooling them, and we have an opportunity right now in our schedules that we've got the flexibility to travel, and this is going to allow us the finances to do so, because we want to be able to fund our adventure and not go into debt in doing so, and showing our kids the country. And this is an opportunity that we saw that we could raise some money to pay for an RV and show them this great country we live in. So, consideration.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Campbell. There are no other speakers. Hearing and seeing no one, we'll close the public hearing, and we will open it up for discussion here, and if we have any disclosures. Discussion? Or a motion to approve?
Move to approve?
Mr. Holt, we call the roll.
There's a motion on the floor to recommend approval to the Board of Supervisors with the conditions as listed in the staff report. Ms. Leverins? Aye. Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Crop?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. And we will move on to Planning Commission considerations.
Nothing on the agenda tonight from staff on that item, Mr. Chairman.
Understood. And I believe we do have the workforce housing task force ongoing. And Mr. Haldeman, if you'd like to say a few words about that.
Sure. I attended the meeting on March 20th last, and the discussion was focused on the vision of the task force and a set of 4 draft principles. I can't say we actually reached agreement on any of them, but there was a lively discussion on defining who should be, who any policies should be addressed toward, whether people who need help with their housing should have to, say, live and work both in James City County. How do you determine that? It's a very complicated process. But it was a 2-hour meeting with a lot of discussion back and forth. Again, nothing determined. Nothing. There was no finality to it. Doing this from memory, which is dangerous at my age, but the meeting before that was an attempt to define affordability or demonstrate affordability, and we went over all the figures of the rather large number of people who live in James City County who are housing stressed. It is a serious problem. There was some discussion. It is called workforce housing. Does that mean we're not supposed to look at affordable housing, which is a different category, of course, and we discussed that again without actually reaching a conclusion. I guess that's really it. If there's any questions,
Thank you, Mr. Alden. Very much. We'll move on now to Planning Director's report. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Other than what's been printed and included in your agenda packets, I don't have anything new or additional to add tonight, but I'd be certainly happy to answer any questions.
Hi everyone, is there a scheduled meeting for Oakland Point for a community that you're aware
We checked back with the applicant as of Friday. There's nothing firm that's been scheduled or set yet that's been shared with us as staff. As soon as we get an update on that, we'll be certain to share.
Else? Okay, thank you, Mr. Holt. With that, I think if anyone has anything else, can I entertain a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
All those in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.